It is the 14th of February, 1943, somewhere in the grey, heaving expanse of the North Atlantic. Inside U-boat U-69, the air is thick with the smell of diesel, damp wool, and fear. 52 men are crammed into a steel tube roughly 56 meters long, roughly the length of half a football pitch, sharing every breath, every noise, every fraying nerve. They have been underwater for 11 hours. The hydrophone operator presses his headset tighter against his ears and reports, quietly, what no one wants to hear. Propeller noise. A British escort somewhere above. The captain orders silence. No one moves. No one speaks. The crew stares at the dripping steel walls and waits. Then something else arrives. Not depth charges, not the grinding shriek of a hull breach, something altogether stranger. A sound, distant at first, then closer, then everywhere. A rhythmic, pulsing tone, low and penetrating, cutting through the water with an almost physical force. Some of the men exchange glances, others press their hands to their ears. Within minutes, the sound has become something more than noise. It is, by every surviving account, from men who experienced it, deeply, viscerally wrong. It does not sound like machinery. It does not sound like anything they were trained to recognize. It sounds, in the words of one German survivor recorded after the war, like the sea itself was screaming. What those men were experiencing was not an accident of acoustics. It was not a mechanical fault aboard their own vessel. It was a weapon, deliberate, precisely engineered, and designed not to destroy the submarine's hull, but to destroy the submarine's crew. The device transmitting that sound was known to its British creators as the Submarine Oscillator, but it would come to be referred to in operational planning documents by a colder, more telling name, the Psychological Warfare Projector. Its purpose was to disorient, terrify, and in the most optimistic projections, to cause the men inside an enemy submarine to turn on one another in panic, to surface not because they had been depth-charged into submission, but because their own minds had made remaining submerged impossible. This is the story of one of the Second World War's least-known weapons programs, the British effort to weaponize sound itself against the crews of the German U-boat fleet. It is a story that sits at an uncomfortable intersection of engineering ingenuity, psychological warfare, and a ruthlessness born of absolute necessity. And it begins, as so many stories of this war do, with the British being very close to losing. By the spring of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered what German submarine commanders would later call the happy time, though there was nothing remotely happy about it from the Allied perspective. Admiral Karl Dönitz had refined his Rudeltaktik, or Wolfpack strategy, into a near-perfect instrument of maritime attrition. Groups of between 8 and 20 U-boats would fan out across convoy routes, guided by Enigma-encoded radio communications from Lorient, Brest and Saint-Nazaire, coordinating attacks that left escort destroyers struggling to defend in multiple directions simultaneously. The numbers were catastrophic. In November 1942 alone, the Allies lost approximately 117 merchant vessels, totaling over 700,000 gross registered tons of shipping. To put that in human terms, oil, food, weapons, ammunition, and the men transporting them were disappearing into the Atlantic at a rate that, extrapolated forward, threatened to sever Britain's supply lines entirely. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. He was not given to easy admissions of fear. The existing countermeasures were, by any honest assessment, inadequate. As Dick, the British-developed echolocation system known today as sonar, could detect a submerged U-boat within roughly 1,500 meters, about 1,640 yards, under ideal conditions. but those conditions were rarely present in the North Atlantic. Temperature gradients, background noise from marine life, and the acoustic interference of the convoy's own engines all degraded Azdika's effectiveness significantly. Even when a contact was confirmed, attacking it required the escort to sail directly over the submarine, during which time Azdik lost contact entirely, leaving the depth charge pattern to be dropped on dead reckoning. A skilled U-boat captain could exploit this blind window to maneuver clear. Depth charges, meanwhile, were blunt instruments. To guarantee a kill, a charge needed to detonate within roughly 6 meters, 20 feet, of the U-boat's pressure hull. At any greater distance, the result was noise, vacuum vibration, and terrified crew, but structurally the submarine was likely to survive. Killing a U-boat with depth charges required patience, ammunition, and luck in roughly equal measure, and the Kriegsmarine was training new crews at a rate that outpaced British losses. It was against this backdrop that a small group of researchers at the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an organization with a deliberately dull name that concealed some of the war's most creative minds, began asking a question that sounded, at first, entirely unscientific. What if you did not need to kill the submarine? What if you only needed to kill the crew's willingness to remain inside it? The Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, operating from offices in London and from a research facility at Havant in Hampshire, was not a conventional weapons program. It attracted physicists, engineers, and a particular breed of lateral thinker who was less interested in solving the problems everyone else was trying to solve, and more interested in identifying the problems nobody had thought to ask. The acoustic program that would eventually produce the submarine oscillator was led, in its early stages, by a team that included acousticians seconded from the BBC's engineering division. Men who understood sound not as a byproduct of mechanical systems, but as a medium with its own physics, its own capacity for harm. Their starting point was a body of research that had been accumulating since the First World War, much of it classified and little of it reassuring. Studies conducted on submarine crews during extended dives had identified a cluster of physiological and psychological effects associated with low-frequency sound exposure. The pressure hull of a submerged submarine is not a passive barrier. It resonates. Every external sound that reaches it is transmitted, modified, and amplified in ways that vary depending on the frequency and the geometry of the vessel. What the Admiralty researchers realized was that certain frequencies, specifically those in the range of approximately 12 to 30 Hz at the lower edge of human hearing, produced effects in enclosed metal spaces that went well beyond mere annoyance. These frequencies, which researchers categorized under the broad term infrasound, do not register clearly as distinct tones in the way that a whistle or a foghorn does. Instead, they are felt as much as heard. A pressure against the chest, a vibration in the inner ear, a sensation that many test subjects described as profound unease, nausea, or the conviction that something was structurally wrong with the space around them. At sufficient intensity, exposure to infrasound in the 12 to 18 Hz range has been documented to produce visual disturbances. The eye's vitreous humor resonates at approximately 18 Hz, causing brief blurring, as well as disorientation, heightened anxiety, and in some cases, genuine panic. The device that the team developed to exploit this vulnerability was, in engineering terms, a remarkable piece of work. The projector itself consisted of a large diameter electromagnetic transducer, essentially a very powerful speaker, housed in a pressure-resistant casing roughly 90 centimeters, about 3 feet, in diameter, and weighing approximately 280 kilograms, 617 pounds. The transducer operated by driving a flexible steel diaphragm at precisely calibrated frequencies using a variable frequency oscillator fed by the escort vessel's electrical supply. This gave operators the ability to sweep through a range of frequencies in real time, identifying those that produced the strongest resonance with the target vessel's hull geometry. The projector was designed to be lowered over the side of an escort vessel on a cable and operated at depth, typically between 5 and 15 meters, 16 to 49 feet, which allowed the acoustic energy to travel through water rather than air. Water transmits sound approximately 4.3 times more efficiently than air, and over the distances involved, the projector could produce measurable effects at ranges of up to 600 meters, roughly 655 yards, under good conditions. The acoustic intensity reaching a submerged U-boat was considerable. The precise output wattage of the operational model remains classified in surviving Admiralty documents, but estimates based on the described generator requirements suggest a peak acoustic output equivalent to a very large industrial compressor operating at close range. Production of the device took place at a facility in Birmingham, with components sourced from the electrical engineering industry. Exact production numbers remain unavailable. What the records do confirm is that by early 1943, a small number of operational units had been distributed to selected escort vessels for sea trials under the cover designation Type X acoustic equipment. The operational use of the submarine oscillator is one of the more frustrating areas for the historian, because the surviving documentary record is fragmentary in ways that are clearly deliberate. After-action reports from the relevant period are either missing, heavily redacted, or classified under provisions that were not fully relaxed until the late 1990s, and even then, certain operational details were withheld. What can be established with reasonable confidence comes from a combination of partially declassified Admiralty files held at the National Archives in Kew, post-war interrogation records of captured U-boat crew members, and a small number of first-hand accounts collected by naval historians in the decades following the armistice. The device appears to have been deployed operationally during the first half of 1943, the same period that saw the broader turn of the tide against the U-boat fleet. Escort vessels operating in the North Atlantic convoy routes, most probably assigned to groups working the HX and SC convoy lanes, are known to have been fitted with the equipment. Whether it was used in conjunction with conventional depth charges as a kind of acoustic pre-softening before a physical attack, or as a standalone measure, is not entirely clear from the available documents. What the post-war interrogation records do provide, with striking consistency, is a picture of U-boat crews who reported experiences during what they believe to be depth charge attacks that do not match the physical signatures of conventional ordnance. Several accounts describe the sensation of pressure without concussion, disorientation in the absence of hull damage, and, most tellingly, conflict between crew members about whether to surface. In at least 3 cases documented in British intelligence summaries, the interrogated survivors described arguments between senior and junior crew members, with some men insisting that the boat was structurally compromised and others maintaining that the instruments showed no such thing. In one account, a junior engineering officer reportedly attempted to open the conning tower hatch while the boat was still at depth, convinced that the hull was flooding, when instrumentation confirmed it was not. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Whether any of these incidents can be directly attributed to the oscillator rather than to the general psychological strain of depth charge attack remains impossible to confirm with certainty. But the pattern is suggestive, and pattern, in the absence of direct evidence, is sometimes the most honest thing the historical record can offer. It would be misleading to examine the British program in isolation without acknowledging that Germany was pursuing parallel lines of thinking, albeit from different starting points. The Kriegsmarine's own acoustic research program, conducted primarily at the Naval Experimental Institute at Kiel, had investigated the use of low-frequency projectors for acoustic mine fusing and for disrupting Allied ASDIC equipment. What the German program does not appear to have developed, at least not in any form that reached operational deployment, was a system specifically designed to affect human physiology and psychology within an enclosed vessel. American research into acoustic weapons during the same period was proceeding along somewhat different lines. The United States Navy was primarily focused on what it called sonic harassment devices intended for surface-to-surface use, disrupting enemy communications and causing disorientation in personnel operating above water. The enclosure-specific research that underpinned the British program, with its focus on resonance within the pressure hull of a submarine, represented a narrower and more technically specific line of inquiry that the Americans do not appear to have replicated independently, at least not during the active conflict period. The British approach was also distinct in its deliberate exploitation of infrasound rather than audible frequency sound. Early experiments with audible frequency projectors, operating in the range humans perceive most acutely, roughly 1,000 to 4,000 Hz, had shown that, while these could certainly be uncomfortable at sufficient intensity, they were too easily attributed to mechanical sources by experienced submarine crews, who would simply dismiss them as acoustic artifacts of the water environment. The genius of the infrasound approach, if genius is the right word for something so coldly calculated, was precisely that it produced effects whose cause was not apparent to the men experiencing them. You cannot rationally dismiss a threat you cannot identify, and a threat you cannot identify in the controlled sensory environment of a submerged submarine is the most frightening kind of all. Assessing the actual strategic impact of the submarine oscillator is an exercise in careful qualification. The spring and summer of 1943 saw a dramatic reversal of the Battle of the Atlantic. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, a rate of attrition that prompted Dönitz to temporarily withdraw his wolf packs from the North Atlantic entirely. This turning point is conventionally attributed to a convergence of factors: the closure of the mid-Atlantic gap through long-range patrol aircraft, improved ASDIC and depth charge technology, the expanded availability of support groups, and, crucially, the Allied codebreakers restored access to Enigma traffic following the capture of cipher materials from U-559 in October 1942. Against this backdrop of multiple simultaneous improvements, isolating the contribution of any single weapon system is close to impossible. The oscillator was deployed on a small number of vessels during a period when many other things were also changing. To claim that it was decisive would be unsupportable. To claim that it was irrelevant would be equally dishonest. What the program does represent, unambiguously, is an early and sophisticated attempt to approach the problem of underwater warfare through the lens of human psychology rather than material destruction. The recognition that the limiting factor in a submerged submarine's operational effectiveness was not the strength of its steel, but the resilience of the 50-odd men inside it. That insight was, by the standards of 1943, genuinely ahead of its time. Non-lethal acoustic weapons research remained an active, if classified, field in both British and American defense establishments for decades after the war. And some of the foundational work done by the Admiralty team appears in the genealogy of later programs, though tracing these connections through classified records is necessarily a partial exercise. As for surviving examples of the equipment itself, if any original projectors still exist, they have not been publicly identified. Several British naval museums hold related acoustic research equipment from the wartime period, and the National Archives at Kew holds the most substantial collection of surviving documentation. Researchers seeking primary sources would do well to begin with the ADM 213 series, with the caveat that significant redactions remain in place. Return, for a moment, to that U-boat in the North Atlantic. Return to those 52 men in their steel tube, breathing recycled air, listening to a sound they could not name and could not explain. The sound that was reaching them had not come from an accident of the sea. It had been designed in a workshop in Hampshire by men with slide rules and oscilloscopes and a very specific understanding of what the human body does when it is placed under certain kinds of acoustic pressure. It had been tuned, refined, and deployed with the express purpose of making those 52 men doubt the reality of what their instruments were telling them, doubt their own perceptions, and ultimately doubt each other. There is something in that which demands a moment of reflection, not moral judgment, the facts being sufficient without it, but recognition of what was actually being attempted. This was not a weapon that sought to crack steel, it sought to crack trust. The trust a crew places in its captain, the trust a man places in his own senses, the trust that makes it possible for 50 people to agree to seal themselves inside a steel cylinder and take it to the bottom of the ocean together. Without that trust, a submarine is not a weapon, it is a trap. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided by many things, by radar and aircraft, and cryptography and industrial production, and the extraordinary ordinary courage of men in merchant vessels who knew they were sailing through waters where submarines were hunting them and went anyway. The oscillator was one instrument in an orchestra of desperation and ingenuity. It was a very British instrument, empirical, slightly strange, operating at the margins of what was considered acceptable, and aimed precisely at the most vulnerable point the enemy possessed. The most powerful weapon that existed inside a German U-boat was not the torpedoes. It was not the pressure hull, or the engines, or the periscope. It was the collective willingness of 50 men to remain calm in a space designed to make calm nearly impossible. The British, in building their acoustic projector, had identified this precisely. They had looked at the most feared weapon in the German arsenal, a weapon that was strangling the Atlantic lifeline, and they had asked, not how do we sink it, but how do we make the men inside it unable to trust themselves?